What was it like to be neighbors with the god of war? Picture Ares, son of Zeus and Hera, roaring through battles yet remaining one of the least revered Olympians. You'd hear stories whispered across Olympus. His affair with Aphrodite caught by Hephaestus, his humiliating capture by the giants Otus and Ephialtes. He wasn't just a symbol of violence, he was the walking embodiment of chaos, and even the other gods kept their distance. But was there more to Ares than the blood and thunder? Let's peer behind the veil of Mount Olympus and see why even gods bristled at the god of war. When Ares was born to Zeus and Hera, it was less a celebration and more a warning. The arrival of a new god on Olympus usually came with ceremony, but this time Zeus' court was quiet. Even nymphs whispered their doubts. Ares wasn't just another addition to the divine family. He was the embodiment of conflict. You could feel the tension ripple through the halls, like the air before a thunderstorm. Hesiod describes the fates weaving each god's destiny, and Ares was tied to conflict from the very beginning. Even as a newborn, he seemed to bring a storm with him. The Olympians had seen their share of troublemakers, but this felt different. Whispers spread quickly, not just among the gods, but down to the nymphs and lesser spirits. The fates had spun an unusual thread for Ares, one that buzzed with agitation and the promise of chaos. His destiny wasn't just about war. It was about the raw, unpredictable force that comes with it. Some of the older gods probably muttered about liability when they thought no one could hear. Even Zeus felt uneasy. Imagine a king whose own blood predicts chaos. The king of the gods, usually so sure of his rule, looked at his son and saw not a future ally, but a walking contradiction. Ares was everything Zeus worked to control: wild, impulsive, and unpredictable. If you picture Zeus as the ruler who values order above all, having a son like Ares must have felt like waiting for a storm to hit your own palace. Hera, on the other hand, saw things differently. If Zeus saw a ticking time bomb, Hera saw something she could shape. Myths often paint Hera as overbearing or manipulative, but this was her child. She had her own ambitions, and maybe she believed she could channel Ares' energy into something that would serve Olympus, or more likely herself. She became fiercely protective, convinced that with the right guidance, Ares could become something more than just a force of destruction. There's even a version of the myth where Hera, out of spite for Zeus, claims she conceived Ares by herself. That detail alone tells you how complicated things were in the royal family. Nobody on Olympus could decide if Ares was a blessing or a curse. His arrival unsettled the pecking order. Even Apollo, who usually played the role of the golden child, kept his distance. Athena, always watchful, observed Ares' entrance in wary silence. The gods weren't used to feeling uneasy about one of their own, but Ares was different. He was the living reminder that chaos could come from inside the family, not just from the mortal world below. If this all sounds a bit familiar, that's because it is. Think about any family with a child who doesn't fit the mold. Parents projecting hopes, siblings sizing up the newcomer, everyone holding their breath to see what happens next. Only in this case, the stakes were a little higher. It wasn't about a kid acting out in school. It was about whether Olympus itself might crack under the pressure of one god's temper. The symbolism was hard to miss. Ares wasn't just born into Olympus. He was born into conflict. His first breath brought disharmony to a realm that prided itself on order and control. The gods liked to think they had everything figured out, but Ares was proof that even the divine aren't immune to unpredictability. Harmony on Olympus was fragile. Sometimes it's not an enemy at the gates that breaks it, but your own child. Even in his earliest days, Ares made his presence felt. The legends say his first cries sent tremors through Olympus and even caused storms in the mortal world. Imagine being a farmer and suddenly facing a freak hailstorm. No idea that somewhere high above a newborn god was wailing. For the immortals, those cries were an omen. Nobody said it out loud, but everyone knew something had changed for good. There's something oddly poetic about it. The birth of a god should be a moment of hope, but with Ares, it was a warning. He represented the uneasy balance between power and danger, creation and destruction. The other gods watched him with a mix of curiosity and dread. Even as a baby, Ares was a problem they couldn't ignore. The children of Olympus weren't immune to the tension. They watched Ares, maybe wondering if he'd be a friend or a rival. Most guessed the latter. The gods had their own hierarchy, and Ares' arrival threatened to shake it up. His presence was like a stone thrown into a still pond, ripples spreading out, disturbing everything in their path. His mother's protectiveness only added to the drama. Hera hovered, convinced she could shape him into something useful. Zeus kept his distance, already wary of the trouble his son might cause. The rest of Olympus watched, waiting for the first sign that the storm would break. And it didn't take long. Even as an infant, Ares' outbursts were legendary. The stories don't dwell on lullabies or gentle moments. Instead, they talk about tantrums that rattled the very foundations of Olympus. The gods, used to peace and predictability, suddenly found themselves on edge. The usual routine, banquets, music, idle gossip, was interrupted by the sound of a child's rage echoing through marble halls. It's easy to forget that even gods have growing pains, but for Ares, those pains were everyone's problem. Every outburst, every tantrum became a reminder that chaos was always lurking just beneath the surface. The less powerful gods and spirits learned to steer clear when he was upset. Even the bravest among them hesitated before crossing his path. The tension wasn't just about noise or broken vases. It was about what Ares represented, a force that couldn't be tamed no matter how hard his mother tried. The gods began to realize that this wasn't just a phase. Ares wasn't going to grow out of it. He was born to disrupt, to challenge, to break whatever peace the Olympians thought they had secured. The uncertainty seeped into daily life. Some gods tried to ignore it, hoping the storm would pass. Others whispered about what might come next. Was this just the beginning, or would Ares' presence change Olympus forever? The feeling of waiting for the next disaster became part of the background, like thunder rumbling on a distant horizon. Still, there was a strange sense of inevitability. Maybe Zeus and Hera wondered what might have been if Ares had been different. A gentler god, someone who brought harmony instead of conflict. But that wasn't his nature, and deep down, they knew it. Ares was the storm, not the calm before it. His earliest days set the tone for everything that followed. Olympus, for all its power, was forced to reckon with the fact that even the gods couldn't control everything. The birth of Ares was a reminder that order is always temporary, and that sometimes the greatest threats come from within. So, as the gods braced themselves for what was to come, Olympus waited, nervous, uncertain, and more than a little afraid. Because when a child's first tantrum can shake the heavens, the real trouble is just beginning. Growing up as a god on Olympus sounds impressive, but for Ares, childhood was more like a never-ending test of patience for everyone else. The trouble started early. Imagine a child whose every outburst sent ripples through the air, whose cries supposedly echoed like thunder. If you've ever watched a toddler throw a fit in public, you know the feeling of tension in the room. Now multiply that by divine power, and you've got a sense of what the other gods endured when Ares was in one of his moods. From the start, Ares made his presence impossible to ignore. While most Olympian children might have learned to rein in their power, Ares seemed to thrive on disruption. He was loud, aggressive, and never content to sit quietly. The halls of Olympus, usually filled with music and laughter, became places where even the bravest gods and nymphs moved a little more carefully. No one wanted to be the one who set him off. His early years weren't just about learning to walk or talk. They were about learning how to survive in a place that wasn't quite sure what to do with him. Hera, his mother, was the one who tried the hardest to manage him. She was fiercely protective but never gentle. Hera believed in discipline, not affection. She saw Ares as a force that needed direction, not coddling. There are stories that say Hera, frustrated by his wildness, once cursed him to be a coward, as if she could shame him into behaving. But even then, she never let anyone else criticize him. If the other gods complained, she was the first to defend her son, her loyalty unshaken even when Ares seemed bent on making her life harder. Maybe she saw something of herself in him, a stubbornness that refused to yield. Ares, for his part, didn't make things easy. He pushed against every boundary, testing the patience of even the most tolerant Olympians. He wasn't interested in rules or expectations. If someone tried to tell him what to do, he did the opposite, just to prove he could. This constant back and forth with Hera shaped him. He learned that power could be used to get attention, to force others to react. If he couldn't win approval, he'd settle for being impossible to ignore. Zeus, his father, had less patience. The king of the gods valued order and control, and Ares represented everything he found troublesome. There are lines in Homer's Iliad where Zeus calls Ares the most hateful of all the gods, and that bitterness wasn't just for show. Zeus didn't see promise in his son's aggression. He saw a problem. Instead of trying to guide Ares, Zeus kept his distance, letting Hera handle the fallout. That rejection stung. It's one thing to be misunderstood by your peers, another to be dismissed by your own father. For Ares, every act of rebellion was a way to push back against that indifference. The other gods learned to keep their distance. While some Olympians were known for their tempers, Ares' anger was different. It wasn't a quick flash that faded. It lingered, simmering beneath the surface. He could turn a simple disagreement into a spectacle, and everyone knew it. The gods would whisper about his latest outburst, careful not to draw his attention. Even the minor spirits and nymphs seemed to scatter when he entered a room. Olympus was a place of power, but Ares made it feel unpredictable. His siblings weren't immune to the chaos. Some, like Hephaestus, kept their heads down and avoided confrontation. Others, like Athena, watched him with a wary eye, already seeing the trouble he could cause. The tension between Ares and his siblings simmered, sometimes flaring up over the smallest slight. The gods had their own pecking order, and Ares never wanted to be at the bottom. He fought for recognition, even if it meant making enemies along the way. As he grew, Ares' reputation spread beyond Olympus. The gods weren't the only one who noticed his temper. Mortals, too, began to tell stories about the young god whose anger could shake the earth. They imagined storms and disasters as signs of his displeasure. Even though these tales were exaggerated, they captured the sense of unease that followed Ares wherever he went. He was becoming a symbol of conflict long before he ever set foot on a battlefield. But being the god of war didn't mean Ares was fearless. The myths say that despite his aggression, he was sometimes quick to retreat when things didn't go his way. Hera's curse may have played a part, or maybe it was the result of growing up in a family that never quite accepted him. The other gods mocked him for his failures, and Ares learned to lash out rather than show vulnerability. The cycle repeated. Anger, rejection, more anger. It was a lonely way to grow up, even for a god. Still, there were moments when Ares tried to find his place. He wanted to prove himself, to show that he was more than just a source of trouble. Sometimes he'd join the other gods in their games or competitions, hoping to earn respect. But his approach was always the same. Force over finesse. Passion over planning. When he won, it was through sheer determination. When he lost, he blamed everyone but himself. The gods saw this as immaturity, another reason to keep their distance. Hera's protectiveness only made things more complicated. She wanted Ares to succeed, but on her terms. If he strayed too far, she'd pull him back. If he embarrassed her, she'd scold him in front of the others. Their relationship was a constant struggle for control, each trying to shape the other. For Ares, it was never clear whether he was fighting for his mother's approval or against her expectations. Either way, the struggle defined his childhood. Zeus, meanwhile, remained aloof. He watched Ares' antics with a mix of annoyance and resignation. The king of the gods had little interest in dealing with his son's problems. Occasionally, he'd step in to restore order, but more often he left the mess for Hera to clean up. The message was clear. Ares was on his own. That sense of isolation fueled his resentment, driving him to seek validation in conflict. The other gods took sides, some sympathizing with Hera, others quietly agreeing with Zeus. No one wanted to be caught in the middle. Even the minor god learned to avoid Ares when he was in a mood. Olympus became a place of careful navigation, everyone tiptoeing around the young god's temper. It wasn't just about avoiding trouble, it was about surviving in a world where chaos was always a possibility. Despite the tension, Ares never stopped trying to assert himself. He challenged anyone who got in his way, refusing to back down. His determination was both his greatest strength and his biggest weakness. The gods admired his courage even as they dreaded the consequences. Ares was relentless, always pushing the boundaries, always demanding more. Sometimes his efforts paid off. There were moments when he managed to impress the other gods, usually through feats of strength or bravery. But the recognition never lasted. As soon as the excitement faded, the old doubts returned. The gods remembered his past mistakes, his inability to control his temper. Ares found himself back where he started, on the outside, looking in. His childhood was a series of battles, each one shaping the god he would become. The constant struggle for approval, the need to prove himself, the fear of rejection, all of it left its mark. Ares learned to rely on his own strength, to trust no one but himself. He became the god of war not just by destiny, but by necessity. The lessons of his youth lingered as he grew older. He carried the scars of rejection, the weight of unmet expectations. The other gods saw him as a force to be managed, not a member of the family. Ares responded in kind, meeting their indifference with defiance. He embraced his role as the outsider, the troublemaker. If Olympus wouldn't accept him, he'd make sure they couldn't forget him. Yet, for all his bluster, there was a vulnerability beneath the surface. Ares wanted to belong, to be respected. He craved the approval of his parents, the acceptance of his peers. But the harder he tried, the more isolated he became. The cycle of anger and rejection continued, shaping every relationship he had. This tension followed Ares into adulthood, coloring his interactions with everyone on Olympus. It was especially obvious in his relationship with his sister Athena. She was everything he wasn't: disciplined, strategic, admired by all. Their rivalry became legendary, a constant source of drama for the gods. Where Ares relied on brute force, Athena used cunning and intelligence. The clash between them was inevitable, and everyone on Olympus watched to see who would come out on top. Sibling rivalry is tough in any family, but when your siblings are gods, the stakes are a little higher. For Ares and Athena, every disagreement was a battle, every victory a chance to prove their worth. Their competition wasn't just about personal pride. It was a reflection of something deeper, a struggle between two very different visions of what it meant to be powerful. And for the rest of Olympus, it meant that peace was always temporary, and conflict was never far away. Sibling rivalry on Olympus wasn't just an occasional spat. It was a daily feature, especially when it came to Ares and Athena. You'd think the two gods both tied to war would find some common ground, but their differences ran deep. Ares stood for the wild, violent rush of battle, the kind that left everything in pieces. Athena, on the other hand, brought order to conflict. She was all about planning, clever maneuvers, and winning wars with your mind as much as your muscle. The Greeks saw these two as the living split between chaos and calculation, and that split colored every interaction they had. If you were an Olympian watching them grow up, you'd probably keep your distance. Imagine wandering through the halls and hearing Athena's measured voice break through the noise, explaining tactics in a way that sounded more like a lesson than advice. "You can't just charge in," she might say. "You have to think 3 moves ahead." Ares, already simmering from some slight or another, would hear that as a challenge. He'd answer with a glare, or more likely, by swinging his spear at a training dummy with enough force to shatter marble. Athena would barely flinch, always ready with a quick retort or a demonstration of why her way worked better. It wasn't just about who could hit harder. It was about proving whose approach to conflict actually mattered. Their arguments spilled out of private moments and into the public life of Olympus. Picture a feast, gods lounging on golden couches, music in the background, when suddenly Ares and Athena start up again. Athena calmly points out every hole in Ares' battle plan, while he fumes and accuses her of cowardice for not fighting properly. For Ares, a proper fight meant meeting force with force, no tricks, no patience. Athena, though, never let herself get dragged into that kind of brawl. She'd wait, watch, and strike when it mattered most, often leaving Ares looking like he'd just lost a game he didn't know he was playing. This wasn't just a family drama. Their rivalry was a kind of living lesson for everyone watching, gods and mortals alike. You could root for Ares' passion and raw strength for a minute, but it didn't take long to see why Athena's way kept winning out. She didn't just outfight Ares, she outthought him. Even the minor gods and nymphs who loved a good spectacle would start to gossip. Did you see Athena turn his own temper against him? He'll be sulking for days. It became clear that on Olympus, brains usually beat brawn. Now, if you want a perfect example of how this rivalry played out, you have to look at the Trojan War. This was the moment when their differences shaped the fate of mortals and gods alike. Ares threw his weight behind the Trojans, drawn by their fierce energy and the chaos of their struggle. Athena, loyal to the Achaeans, guided their leaders with strategy and patience. It was more than just picking sides. It was a clash of ideals, played out in the blood and dust of the battlefield. One scene from the Iliad says it all. Ares, in full war cry, charges across the field, scattering soldiers like leaves in a storm. He's unstoppable, or so it seems. Then Athena steps in, not with a bigger weapon, but with a plan. She teams up with Diomedes, a mortal whose courage matches her own sharp mind. With Athena's guidance, Diomedes manages to wound Ares himself. The god of war, brought low by a human, staggers back, bellowing in pain. He flees to Olympus, humiliated, and the other gods, especially Zeus, don't let him forget it. Zeus calls Ares the most hateful of all gods, a reminder that even in his own family, Ares can't win respect through force alone. For mortals watching from below, this was a revelation. Here was Ares, the figure they'd prayed to for courage in battle, shown to be vulnerable, defeated not by greater strength, but by a clever plan and a steady hand. It was a moment that shifted loyalties. If you were a soldier in the trenches, you might start leaving offerings at Athena's altar instead, hoping for a bit of her wisdom to see you through. The message was clear. War isn't won by rage alone. And that's really the point of their rivalry. Ares embodied the heat of battle, the rush that made men brave but also reckless. Athena stood for the kind of victory that lasts, the kind that comes from knowing when to fight and when to wait. The Greeks didn't just respect that, they built their stories around it. Every time Ares and Athena clashed, it was another example of why balance mattered, why even the strongest warrior needed a plan. It wasn't just about who won or lost. Their rivalry shaped how the Greeks understood war itself. Ares was honored in places that valued courage and ferocity, but his worship was never as widespread or as warm as Athena's. She was the patron of heroes, the one who helped mortals survive and succeed. Ares was a warning. Let your anger run wild and you'll end up alone, licking your wounds. Of course, that didn't stop Ares from trying. He never gave up. Never stopped challenging Athena, even when he knew the odds. Every time he lost, he'd come back for more, convinced that this time, brute force would win the day. It never did, but you almost have to admire the persistence. Watching Ares charge headlong into another defeat, you get the sense that he couldn't help himself. It was in his nature, a lesson, maybe, for anyone who's ever tried to change who they are just to get ahead. Athena, for her part, seemed almost bored by his efforts. She didn't need to shout or show off. Her victories spoke for themselves, and if she ever felt sorry for Ares, she didn't show it. Instead, she kept proving, again and again, that wisdom outlasts fury. For the rest of Olympus, their rivalry was a reminder that even gods have something to prove. and that some lessons have to be learned the hard way. You can picture the gossip that must have swirled through Olympus after each of their confrontations. In the marble courtyards and shaded groves, gods and nymphs would trade stories about Ares' latest defeat, the clever way Athena turned his own aggression against him. It was entertainment, sure, but it was also a warning. Don't let your temper get the best of you. Don't mistake noise for strength. If you look at the myths, you'll see that Athena's victories weren't just personal. They set the standard for what made a hero. The Greeks loved stories of cleverness and cunning, of outsmarting a stronger foe. Athena's influence ran deep, shaping not just the outcome of wars, but the very idea of what it meant to win. Ares might have inspired fear, but Athena inspired respect. Their rivalry didn't just affect the gods, it trickled down into the way mortals lived and fought. Every time a general chose to wait for the right moment instead of charging in, every time a soldier trusted his training over his instincts, you could see Athena's hand at work. Ares was always there too, a reminder that passion and courage have their place, but only when guided by something more. It's easy to see why their feud lasted as long as it did. Neither could really change who they were. Ares would always be the first into the fray, the last to back down. Athena would always be the one with the plan, watching and waiting for her moment. Their rivalry was as old as war itself, and as long as there were battles to fight, they'd keep finding reasons to clash. For everyone else on Olympus, these battles were more than just family drama. They were a way to make sense of the world, a reminder that every fight has two sides, and that victory comes to those who know how to balance strength with sense. Maybe that's why their story still matters even now. But even the god of war had moments when his attention wandered from battlefields and rivalries. Sometimes conflict took a different form, one that didn't involve spears or strategy at all. Because when Ares crossed paths with the goddess of love, the rules changed, and for once even he couldn't predict how it would end. When the god of war and the goddess of love decided to ignore Olympus's unspoken boundaries, the result was more than just a secret fling. It was a scandal that left even the gods talking. Ares and Aphrodite's affair wasn't a quiet rumor. It was a collision of two forces, one all brute impulse, the other irresistible allure. You could say the gods had seen it all, but this union set a new standard for divine drama. Aphrodite, for her part, wasn't single. She was married to Hephaestus, the god of fire and metalworking, who was nothing like the other shining athletic Olympians. Hephaestus was clever, persistent, and skilled at his craft, but he didn't fit the mold of the glamorous gods lounging in golden halls. Some myths say Zeus forced Aphrodite into this marriage as a punishment for her vanity, while others claim Hephaestus won her hand as a reward. Either way, it was a marriage of arrangement, not passion. Ares, on the other hand, brought the kind of energy that shook up any room he entered. Where Hephaestus was steady and practical, Ares was reckless and magnetic. It's not hard to see why Aphrodite was drawn to him. Their affair wasn't subtle, and it definitely wasn't private. In the world of the gods, where everyone's business was everyone else's business, their relationship was an open secret, one that everyone pretended not to notice until it became impossible to ignore. The real turning point came when Hephaestus decided he'd had enough. He wasn't about to let himself be humiliated without a response. Using all the cunning and skill he was known for, Hephaestus forged a net, so fine it was nearly invisible, but strong enough to hold even gods. He set his trap and waited. When Ares and Aphrodite were together, the net snapped shut, catching them in the act. Hephaestus didn't keep his discovery to himself. He summoned the other gods, dragging them in to witness the spectacle. There, in front of the full assembly, Ares and Aphrodite were exposed, literally and figuratively, caught in Hephaestus's unbreakable snare. The gods didn't react with sympathy. They laughed, they jeered, and some probably filed away the memory for future gossip. Poseidon eventually intervened and convinced Hephaestus to release them, but the damage was done. The humiliation was public, and the story spread far beyond Olympus. This wasn't just a moment of embarrassment for Ares and Aphrodite. Their affair, and the way it was revealed, exposed the cracks in the image the gods tried to project. Even immortals, it turned out, could get tangled up in jealousy, betrayal, and revenge. For Ares, who was already seen as impulsive and undisciplined, the scandal only reinforced his reputation. For Aphrodite, it showed that the goddess of love wasn't immune to the messiness of desire, but their relationship had consequences beyond gossip. Ares and Aphrodite's union produced children who embodied the complicated legacy of their parents. The most well-known were Phobos and Deimos, the personifications of fear and terror. These two didn't just exist in the background, they often accompanied Ares into battle, amplifying the dread that spread through opposing armies. When Ares appeared on the battlefield, Phobos and Deimos were there, making sure that fear and panic ran ahead of the fighting. Hesiod describes them as constant companions to their father, reinforcing the idea that Ares' presence brought not just violence, but a psychological edge that could break even the bravest warriors. Then there was Harmonia, a daughter who stood out from her brothers. Where Phobos and Deimos represented the chaos and horror of war, Harmonia symbolized the peace that sometimes follows conflict. Her very existence was a kind of contradiction, born from the union of war and love. She embodied the hope that something good could come out of turmoil. Harmonia's role in myth was quieter but no less important. She was a reminder that even the most destructive forces could, in rare moments, give way to balance and reconciliation. The children of Ares and Aphrodite weren't just side notes in the myths. They were living reminders of what happens when love and conflict mix. Phobos and Deimos made the battlefield a place of psychological warfare, not just physical combat. Harmonia offered a glimpse of what might be possible when the fighting stopped. Together, they show that Ares was more than a one-dimensional god of rage. His relationship with Aphrodite complicated his image, adding layers that went beyond the usual stories of blood and thunder. Still, it's important not to romanticize the affair. The fallout was real. The gods didn't suddenly see Ares in a softer light because he had a family. If anything, the scandal made him even more of an outsider. He was still the god whose temper got him into trouble, whose decisions often made things worse. Aphrodite's reputation didn't improve either. Despite being the goddess of love, she was now seen as the center of a messy public drama. Their children, for all their symbolism, didn't erase the tensions their parents had created. If you were an observer on Olympus, you'd see that the affair didn't change the basic dynamics among the gods. Ares was still quick to anger, still prone to acting without thinking. Aphrodite was still the embodiment of desire, able to sway gods and mortals alike. Their relationship was another example of how even the most powerful beings couldn't escape the consequences of their choices. The story of Ares and Aphrodite is one of those myths that sticks with you, not because it's a simple tale of love, but because it's a reminder of how complicated things get when passion and pride collide. The gods might have laughed at their humiliation, but the impact lingered. Their children carried the legacy forward, shaping the way people thought about war, fear, and the possibility of peace. For Ares, the affair didn't mark a turning point where he suddenly became wiser or more restrained. If anything, it confirmed what everyone already suspected. He was a force that couldn't be contained, even by the rules of Olympus. The net came down, the laughter faded, but Ares returned to what he knew best: conflict, both on and off the battlefield. The relationship with Aphrodite might have added some complexity to his character, but it didn't erase the tension that followed him everywhere. If anything, it set the stage for even more dramatic confrontations. The gods had seen him caught and humiliated, but that didn't mean they'd seen the last of his temper. The truth is, Ares' greatest clashes were still to come, and this time, the targets weren't just lovers, they were his own family. The fallout from those battles would shake Olympus in ways no scandal ever could. Olympus didn't need outside threats to keep things interesting. Ares was more than enough. Imagine a bar fight that brings down city walls. Ares' temper wreaked havoc even among gods. His reputation for chaos wasn't just a rumor. It was a daily reality. His anger could turn a simple disagreement into an all-out spectacle, and no one, not even his family, was safe from the fallout. You'd think being the god of war would earn him some respect, but with Ares, it was mostly the opposite. Zeus, his own father, barely tried to hide his contempt. In Homer's Iliad, Zeus doesn't hold back, calling Ares the most hateful of all the gods. That's not a casual insult. It's a public condemnation, straight from the king of Olympus. Ares, for his part, didn't take that lying down. He spent his days pushing against the boundaries Zeus set, trying to prove his worth through force and fury. But Zeus wasn't impressed by displays of violence. If anything, every outburst just drove the wedge deeper. It wasn't just Zeus either. Ares had a way of making enemies out of almost everyone. Poseidon, with his own pride and power, clashed with Ares when their domains overlapped. Apollo, always calm and unflappable, seemed to exist just to remind Ares of everything he wasn't: measured, patient, and in control. Even among gods who thrived on drama, Ares stood out as the one who could never just let things go. His impulsive nature left little room for compromise, and Olympus was a place where egos ran high. The thing is, most of the other gods could work around each other. They'd argue, scheme, and occasionally throw a fit, but there was usually some kind of balance. Not with Ares. He didn't just disrupt the peace, he shattered it. When he lost his temper, the effects rippled out. The minor gods and nymphs learned to stay out of his way, and the mood of Olympus could shift in an instant. If you were unlucky enough to be nearby when Ares decided to settle a score, you'd probably want to duck for cover. One of the most telling episodes in Ares' story is his capture by the giants Otus and Ephialtes. This wasn't a minor embarrassment. It was a humiliation that echoed through Olympus. Hesiod's Theogony and Homer's Iliad both mention this moment. The god of war, who prided himself on his strength, was outsmarted by two mortal-born giants. Otus and Ephialtes didn't overpower Ares with brute force. They trapped him, stuffed him into a bronze jar, and left him there for 13 months, a full lunar year. Homer describes Ares screaming hoarse in chains, his voice echoing from the jar while the giants strutted around, pleased with themselves. No one rushed to help. The gods seemed content to let Ares stew, maybe thinking Olympus was quieter without him around. It wasn't until Hermes, ever the clever mediator, slipped in and freed him that Ares was released. You can picture the aftermath. Ares, usually so loud and defiant, comes back to Olympus not as a conquering hero, but as someone who's just been shown the limits of his power. There's no grand parade, no celebration, just a god who's tasted helplessness and a pantheon that's learned they can survive without his constant chaos. For Ares, this had to sting. His whole identity was built on being untouchable, and now everyone had seen him at his weakest. It's the kind of thing that could make anyone rethink their approach. But Ares wasn't one for deep introspection. The story didn't just end with his release. The fact that Ares could be captured at all was a warning to everyone, including himself. It showed that strength alone wasn't enough, that even the god of war needed allies and a little bit of caution. But if you think Ares learned his lesson, you'd be disappointed. He went right back to his old ways, charging into conflict and letting his temper call the shots. His run-ins with the other gods weren't limited to brawls and shouting matches. Sometimes his impulsiveness had more lasting consequences. Take the story of his daughter, Alcippe. When Halirrhothios, son of Poseidon, attacked Alcippe, Ares didn't hesitate. He killed Halirrhothios on the spot, acting as judge, jury, and executioner. This wasn't just a private act of vengeance. It turned into a public scandal. The gods put Ares on trial at the Areopagus, the first murder trial in mythic history. Ares defended his actions as those of a protective father, but the trial itself became a symbol of the chaos he brought with him. The Areopagus, a place associated with reason and justice, was now tied to the impulsive violence of the god of war. This trial did more than just air Ares' dirty laundry. It set a precedent for how the gods dealt with their own, and it reminded everyone that even divine power had limits. Ares wasn't above the law, at least not when the other gods decided to enforce it. The outcome wasn't really about justice for Halirrhothios or Alcippe. It was about reminding Ares that his actions had consequences, even for a god. If you were a minor god, or an ordinary resident of Olympus, watching all this unfold, you'd probably be a little wary of Ares. He could be protective, sure, but he was just as likely to cause trouble as to fix it. His presence was a double-edged sword. On one hand, he was a force to be reckoned with when Olympus faced real danger. On the other, his unpredictability made him a liability. You never knew if he was going to be the hero or the problem. Even after the trial, Ares kept finding ways to stir things up. He didn't change. He just added new grudges to his list. Every slight, every perceived insult became another excuse for a fight. The gods learned to tread carefully around him, and the stories about his temper grew with every retelling. For mortals, these tales became lessons about the dangers of unchecked anger and the price of letting passion override reason. But there were moments when Ares' strength was needed. When Olympus faced threats from outside, monsters, giants, or other gods, it was Ares who charged in first. The others might have rolled their eyes at his antics, but they couldn't deny his value in a crisis. His raw energy, his refusal to back down, made him indispensable. Even so, The gratitude never lasted. As soon as the danger passed, the old resentments resurfaced, and Ares went back to being the outsider. What's striking is how little Ares seemed to learn from any of it. He had flashes of humility, especially after his time in the bronze jar, but they never stuck. He was always quick to return to old habits, as if admitting weakness even for a moment was too much to bear. If anything, these moments of vulnerability just made him more determined to prove himself, leading to even more spectacular clashes. The rest of Olympus didn't make things easier. Zeus, Athena, Hera all had their own reasons for keeping Ares at arm's length. They saw him as a necessary evil, someone to be used when needed and ignored the rest of the time. Ares felt that exclusion and responded the only way he knew how, by making himself impossible to ignore. Every argument, every fight, was a way to demand attention, to force the others to acknowledge him, even if it was just to complain about the mess he left behind. For mortals, these stories weren't just gossip from the heavens, they were warnings and explanations for the chaos of the world. When wars broke out, when tempers flared, people could look to Ares and see a reflection of their own struggles. He was a reminder that power without control could be just as dangerous as any enemy. The myths didn't shy away from his flaws. If anything, they leaned into them, using Ares as a cautionary tale. Still, there's something almost relatable about him. Everyone knows someone who can't help but cause trouble, who acts first and thinks later, who never quite fits in no matter how hard they try. Ares was that person, just scaled up to divine proportions. His story is less about victory and more about the cost of never learning when to stop. Of course, his biggest challenges weren't always from within Olympus. Sometimes the real humiliation came from outside, from those he was supposed to dominate without question. And when mortals managed to bring down the god of war, it sent shockwaves through both the heavens and the earth. The truth is, even the most powerful can be brought low, and for Ares, those defeats were the hardest to swallow. If you ever wondered how a god handles being outmaneuvered by a mortal, Ares provides a pretty clear answer. Not well, and definitely not quietly. The god of war built his identity on being the unstoppable force on any battlefield, so when a mortal hero managed to wound him, it wasn't just a personal blow. It was an event that echoed across Olympus, and down to the mortals who worshipped, feared, and sometimes mocked him. Let's start with the most famous example, the Trojan War. Picture Ares at his most confident, armored up and convinced of his own invincibility. He strides onto the field, ready to tip the scales for the Trojans, certain that no mortal could possibly stand in his way. Enter Diomedes, one of the Achaeans' best, brave and skilled, but still, at the end of the day, just a man. Except Diomedes isn't alone. Athena, who has her own reasons for wanting to see Ares taken down a peg, gives Diomedes the power to face him directly. In Homer's Iliad Book 5, Athena doesn't just guide Diomedes, she actively helps him, making sure his spear will find its mark. So there's Ares roaring and rampaging when Diomedes, with Athena's backing, hurls his spear. It pierces Ares, and for a moment, the god of war is just another casualty on the field. Homer describes Ares' cry as so loud it could have come from 10,000 men. No need to imagine how that sounded. The Greeks already knew it was a scream that made everyone stop and stare. The god who thrived on chaos is suddenly the source of it, but not in the way he intended. He's wounded, bleeding ichor, and instead of rallying the Trojans or making a dramatic stand, he retreats. He leaves the battlefield, heading straight for Olympus to complain to Zeus about his treatment. Ares' return to Olympus doesn't win him any sympathy. Zeus, never shy about playing favorites, mocks his son. He tells Ares outright that he deserved the wound for his recklessness and the trouble he causes. There's no fatherly comfort, just a reminder that even among the gods, Ares' style of fighting is more liability than asset. It's a public dressing down, and the other gods probably didn't bother hiding their amusement. For mortals, this story changed everything. Ares wasn't just the embodiment of war anymore. He was a god who could be hurt, who could lose, who could even be driven off the field by a mortal with the right help. The legend of Diomedes wounding Ares became a story that offered hope. It wasn't just about divine intervention, it was about what could happen when courage and skill met opportunity. Suddenly, war wasn't just about brute force. It was about the possibility that intelligence, strategy, and a little bit of luck could overcome even the most terrifying power. And Diomedes wasn't the only mortal to show Ares his limits. Heracles, another hero with divine connections, managed to best Ares as well. In one myth, Heracles, again with Athena's protection, faced off against Ares. Heracles wasn't stronger than Ares by himself, but he was clever, resourceful, and, most importantly, willing to use every advantage at his disposal. Ares, as always, relied on his strength and his temper, and once again, that wasn't enough. Heracles' victory reinforced the lesson. Ares' volatility and single-mindedness could be turned against him by anyone who refused to play by his rules. These stories of defeat weren't just entertaining tales for mortals. They became a kind of instruction manual. If even the god of war could be wounded or outwitted, then maybe the world wasn't as fixed or hopeless as it seemed. Soldiers and generals started to see that courage mattered, but so did planning and adaptability. The Greeks valued cunning as much as strength, and Ares' repeated losses made that point in a way no lecture ever could. On Olympus, Ares' reputation took a hit. His peers saw him less as a fearsome rival and more as a cautionary tale. His power was undeniable, but it was also unreliable. He could be counted on to throw himself into a fight, but not to win it. His defeats at the hands of mortals didn't just bruise his ego, they exposed the cracks in his whole approach to conflict. The gods, who had always kept Ares at arm's length, now had proof that his way wasn't always the best way. They saw how easily his rage could be redirected, how his predictability made him vulnerable. Ares didn't take these lessons to heart. Each defeat just fueled his anger. After Diomedes wounded him, he went right back to the front lines, determined to prove he was still the god of war. But every time he fell into the same traps, rushing in, refusing to adapt, letting his temper lead him into disaster. The cycle repeated itself. Humiliation, rage, another reckless charge, and another defeat. There was no reflection, no attempt to change. For Ares, the answer to every setback was more of the same. If you're watching this from the sidelines, you can't help but notice the pattern. Ares' repeated defeats highlighted his volatility and the value of strategy over brute force. The Greeks, who loved stories where cleverness triumphed over strength, saw Ares as the perfect example of what happens when you refuse to learn. His story was a warning. Don't let pride or anger blind you to what's actually happening. Don't assume that power alone will save you. Yet there's something almost sympathetic about Ares' stubbornness. No matter how many times he lost, he never stopped trying. He kept coming back, battered but unbroken, always ready for the next fight. It wasn't wisdom, but it was resilience. He was a god who refused to give up, even when everyone around him had lost faith in his methods. That kind of persistence, even if misguided, is hard not to respect on some level. The stories of Ares' defeats didn't just stay on Olympus. They filtered down to the mortal world, shaping how people thought about war, power, and even the gods themselves. Ares went from being a distant, terrifying figure to someone almost familiar, a powerful being with obvious flaws, who could be beaten by those who kept their heads and used their wits. His vulnerability made him more relatable, and maybe even a little less frightening. But of course, Ares wasn't just a punchline. His presence on the battlefield still inspired terror, and his moments of rage could still change the course of a war. The difference was that now everyone knew he could be stopped. His power had limits, and those limits were set not just by other gods, but by mortals who refused to back down. That realization didn't make Ares any less dangerous, but it did change the way people approached him. They started to see that even the most overwhelming force could be managed or even overcome with the right combination of courage and planning. The Greeks told these stories for a reason. They wanted to remind themselves and each other that fate wasn't fixed, that even the gods could be challenged. Ares' defeats became a kind of mythic encouragement. If you were facing impossible odds, you could remember Diomedes or Heracles and know that victory wasn't out of reach. The world was unpredictable, and sometimes the underdog won. It's easy to imagine the conversation that happened around ancient fires or in the training grounds before a battle. Someone would mention the time Diomedes wounded Ares, and suddenly the fear of facing a stronger enemy seemed a little less overwhelming. The story wasn't just about humiliation, it was about possibility. If the god of war could bleed, then maybe anyone could. Ares himself never really changed. He kept fighting, kept losing, kept raging. The gods learned to use his predictability to their advantage, steering him into fights where his chaos could do the least harm. Mortals learned to respect his power, but not to fear it without question. The myths didn't let Ares off the hook, but they didn't erase his importance either. He was still the god of war, still the embodiment of conflict, but now with all the messiness and contradiction that came with being fallible. His defeats by mortals didn't break him, but they did leave a mark. The story stuck, shaping how everyone, gods and mortals alike, saw him. He became a symbol of what happens when you refuse to adapt, when you let anger and pride guide your every move. But he also became a reminder that even the strongest can be challenged, and that sometimes the most important victories come from unexpected places. The fallout from these defeats didn't just affect Ares. They rippled through Olympus, changing the way the gods interacted, the way they planned, the way they prepared for the next crisis. If Ares could be taken down by a mortal, then maybe nothing was as certain as it seemed. The gods watched, and so did the mortals, waiting to see what would happen the next time Ares lost control. That uncertainty about what Ares might do next, about how far his rage could go, hung over Olympus like a storm cloud. The lessons of his defeats were clear, but the consequences of ignoring them were even clearer. Because
because there came a day when Ares' anger didn't just lead to another embarrassing loss or a bruised ego. It threatened to unravel everything the gods had built. And if you're wondering how close Olympus ever came to collapse, you'll want to hear what happened when Ares' fury finally went too far.
Sometimes the balance on Olympus didn't tip because of some grand scheme or a world-ending prophecy. It was more subtle than that. A slow build of tension, a god's pride bruised one too many times, and a moment where impulse overruled everything else. That's what happened when Ares, driven by a lifetime of slights and rivalry, let his fury run unchecked. No cataclysmic end for the gods, no world split in two, but a series of choices that rattled the foundations of both Olympus and the world below. Ares' impulsive nature was legendary. Everyone on Olympus knew he was quick to anger, slow to forgive, and never one for careful planning. His approach to conflict was simple. Charge first, think later, if at all. This wasn't just a personality quirk, it was a flaw that the other gods watched with a mix of annoyance and unease. Most of them had learned to work around him, but there were times when Ares' temper threatened to spill over in ways that made even the immortals uneasy. You saw this most clearly during the Trojan War. The gods had already taken sides, turning a mortal conflict into a cosmic feud. Ares, drawn in by his attachment to Aphrodite and his usual appetite for battle, threw his support behind the Trojans. It wasn't a calculated choice. If anything, it was a reaction, a way to spite Athena and Hera, who openly favored the Achaeans. The battlefield became a stage for old grudges, and Ares was front and center, determined to prove that sheer force could win the day. It didn't take long for things to get out of hand. Ares stormed across the battlefield, terrifying mortals and igniting chaos wherever he went. Soldiers who saw him coming often broke ranks, convinced that no human effort could stand against a god in full fury. His presence was enough to tilt the odds, at least for a moment. But Ares never understood the bigger picture. He didn't coordinate with the other gods on his side, didn't think about long-term strategy. He just wanted to fight, and to win. That's where Athena came in. She wasn't just the goddess of wisdom and war, she was the counterweight to everything Ares represented. Where he charged, she planned. Where he raged, she calculated. Their rivalry wasn't just personal, it was a clash of philosophies played out in the dust and blood of Troy. Athena's support for Diomedes, one of the Achaeans' best, was a turning point. She gave him the courage and the divine edge needed to face Ares directly. The moment Diomedes wounded Ares is one of those scenes that sticks with you. Homer describes it in Iliad Book 5. Athena guides Diomedes' spear, and it strikes Ares, forcing the god to retreat in pain. Ares' roar shakes the battlefield, but it's not the triumphant cry of a victor. It's frustration, humiliation, and disbelief all rolled together. He's not used to being vulnerable, especially not in front of mortals and rival gods. And when he flees to Olympus, he's met not with sympathy, but with Zeus's familiar disdain. Zeus calls him the most hateful of all the gods, blaming Ares' own recklessness for his pain. No comfort, no support, just a reminder of how little his father values his approach. This wasn't the first time Ares' impulsiveness had gotten him in trouble, and it wouldn't be the last. His anger didn't just stay on the battlefield, it spilled over into Olympus, straining relationships and making the other gods wary. They'd seen what happened when Ares refused to listen, when he let emotion drive every decision. And they knew that if left unchecked, his actions could have consequences far beyond a single lost battle. That pattern played out again and again. Ares would get slighted by Zeus, by Athena, sometimes even by mortals, and he'd respond with force. There's no myth where he sits down to negotiate, no story where he steps back and considers the outcome. Every problem looked like a fight to him, and every solution was a show of strength. The trouble was, Olympus relied on some level of cooperation. When Ares ignored that, things got messy. One of the most striking examples of this came not from a single explosion of violence, but from the way Ares' actions set off chain reactions. When he lost control, it wasn't just about him and his immediate opponent. The effects rippled out. Gods took sides, mortals suffered, and the lines between order and chaos blurred. The Trojan War was full of these moments. Ares' support for the Trojans made the conflict longer and bloodier than it needed to be. His refusal to see past his own anger meant that peace was always just out of reach. There were smaller, quieter moments too. In the founding myth of Thebes, Ares' legacy was one of conflict and unrest. Cadmus, the city's founder, killed a dragon sacred to Ares and had to serve the god for years as penance. Thebes became a place marked by strife, its history shaped by the lingering influence of the god of war. People in Thebes saw their troubles as a reflection of Ares' presence, a reminder that the god's quarrels could leave scars that lasted for generations. But it was during the Trojan War that Ares' lack of foresight nearly tipped the balance on Olympus. His unchecked rage, his refusal to listen to reason, forced the other gods to intervene. Athena, as usual, took the lead. She never tried to overpower Ares with brute force. Instead, she used strategy, distracting him, undermining his confidence, and enlisting others to help contain him. Hephaestus, the craftsman god, sometimes played a role, crafting tools or traps that could restrain even the wildest immortal. Zeus, for his part, watched all of this with a mix of irritation and resignation. He didn't want Olympus torn apart by one god's temper, but he also wasn't interested in coddling Ares. When things got out of hand, Zeus would step in, usually with a thunderbolt or a harsh word. In the Iliad, after Ares complains about his wound, Zeus tells him that he brings trouble on himself and that he would have punished him more severely if he weren't his son. It's a cold comfort, but it keeps Ares in check, at least for a while. The mortals caught in the middle didn't have that luxury. When the gods fought, it was the people on the ground who paid the price. Storms, sudden violence, and the constant threat of war all traced back to the feuds on Olympus. Farmers lost their crops, soldiers lost their lives, and cities like Thebes and Troy became symbols of what happened when divine quarrels spilled over into the mortal world. Ares' storms, both literal and metaphorical, tested the balance of Olympus more than once. His impulsiveness forced the other gods to act, to pull together in ways they might not have otherwise. It was a reminder that even immortals had limits, that unchecked emotion could threaten the order they all relied on. The gods didn't fear annihilation, but they did fear the kind of chaos Ares brought with him. After each crisis, things would settle down. The other gods would tighten their grip, watch Ares more closely, and try to steer him away from disaster. But he never changed. He'd go quiet for a while, maybe brood on his losses. But sooner or later, something would set him off again. The cycle repeated: anger, conflict, intervention, uneasy peace. If you were an outsider watching all of this, you'd see the pattern. Ares wasn't evil, just unable to control himself, unable to see past the next fight. His power was real, but it was always on the edge of becoming a problem for everyone else. The gods learned to work around him, to use his strength when they needed it and contain it when they didn't. What stands out looking back isn't the destruction Ares caused, but what it revealed about the world of the gods. Olympus wasn't a place of perfect harmony. It was a place where emotion, rivalry, and pride shaped every decision. Ares was just the most obvious example, a god who wore his flaws for everyone to see. There's a kind of honesty in that. Ares didn't pretend to be something he wasn't. He didn't hide his anger or try to cover up his mistakes. He acted, he failed, and he kept going. The other gods might have judged him, but they also relied on him. When danger threatened, Ares was the first to charge in. When peace returned, he was the first to get restless. In the end, Ares' storms didn't destroy Olympus. They tested it, exposed its weaknesses, and forced the gods to confront their own limits. The balance always returned, but never without scars. Mortals told stories about the day the god of war lost control, not because it ended the world, but because it showed how close things could come to falling apart. And if you're paying attention, there's something to learn from all of this. Watching Ares stumble through his own mistakes, you start to see the patterns, the push and pull between chaos and order, emotion and restraint. His story isn't just about battles and grudges, it's about what happens when you let your feelings run the show, when you refuse to listen, and when you keep fighting even when the cost is clear. But that's not the whole story. There's more to Ares than anger and defeat. If you look closely, you'll find moments that hint at something deeper, a kind of resilience, a passion that never quite burns out, and a lesson that goes beyond the battlefield. Before we move on, take a moment to think about what all this chaos really means, because sometimes the gods aren't just stories about power, they're mirrors for the messiness inside us all. If you spent any time watching Ares, you'd probably come away with a lot more questions than answers. What can you actually learn from the god of war? A figure so tangled up in chaos, rivalry, and raw emotion. The truth is, there are lessons tucked into every myth about him, lessons that aren't always obvious, but stick with you all the same. Start with the basics. Ares was the living, breathing argument for what happens when you let instinct run wild. Unlike Athena, who waited, watched, and outmaneuvered her enemies, Ares just charged in. No planning, no patience. He was the side of war that everyone feared, the noise, the mess, the pain that didn't discriminate. The Greeks didn't love him for it. They respected courage, sure, but they also knew that courage without control could get you killed. That's why Ares was never as popular as Athena or even Apollo. He was a warning sign, not a role model. If you look at his rivalry with Athena, you see the Greeks' own struggle with war. They wanted to believe in strategy and discipline, but they couldn't ignore the reality of violence and passion. Athena was the war they wished for, a contest of minds, a battle you could win by being clever. Ares was the war they got, unpredictable, ugly, and impossible to contain. When you watched them clash, it wasn't just two gods fighting, it was the Greeks wrestling with their own fears about what war really meant. Their battles became lessons in themselves. On the battlefield of Troy, Diomedes, with Athena's help, wounds Ares. is a moment that says everything. Brute force alone isn't enough. Even the god of war can be brought down by someone who thinks ahead. The Greeks told this story for a reason. They wanted their children, their soldiers, even their leaders to remember that strength without strategy is just noise. Every time Ares lost to Athena or to a mortal with a bit of divine guidance, it was a reminder that reason should win out over rage. But Ares wasn't just a punching bag for the lesson of think before you act. He was complicated and sometimes even sympathetic. Take his affair with Aphrodite. Sure, it ended in disaster, but for a moment you saw something different in him. Underneath all the posturing and bravado, there was a side of Ares that wanted to be seen, to be loved, to be something more than just a force of destruction. When Hephaestus caught him in that invisible net, the laughter of the gods was loud, but you have to wonder if anyone felt a pang of recognition. Who hasn't been caught off guard by their own feelings? Who hasn't made a mess of things even when they meant well? Ares' vulnerability didn't make him any less dangerous, but it did make him more real. The Greeks didn't write him off as just a villain. They made him a part of the family, flaws and all. His children with Aphrodite, Phobos and Deimos, the personifications of fear and terror, weren't just monsters. They were the emotions that followed Ares everywhere, the proof that war isn't just about swords and spears. It's about what happens in your head, the dread and panic that can break you before the fighting even starts. His capture by Otus and Ephialtes is another story that sticks with you. The god of war, trapped in a bronze jar, screaming himself hoarse for months, while Olympus carried on without him. There's something almost pitiful about it. Ares' repeated comebacks reflected resilience rather than reflection. He didn't emerge from that jar wiser or humbler. He just came back, as stubborn as ever, ready for the next fight. For the Greeks, this wasn't a story about redemption. It was a story about persistence, about what happens when you refuse to change, even when the world gives you every reason to. And then there's the trial after he killed Halirrhothios. For once, Ares wasn't acting out of blind rage. He was protecting his daughter. The gods put him on trial, and he stood there, not as the god of war, but as a father. You could almost see the other gods shifting in their seats, wondering if there was more to him than they'd thought. But even then, Ares didn't change course. He defended his actions, took the consequences, and moved on. No apologies, no promises to do better next time. The Greeks used Ares to talk about the limits of power. In myth after myth, Ares' raw power was checked only by strategy, teaching mortals that brute force has limits. He was the god you called on when you needed courage, but you didn't want him sticking around. Too much of Ares, and things fell apart. Not enough, and nothing happened at all. The trick was finding balance, using passion to get started, but not letting it run the show. If you were a mortal watching all this unfold, you'd probably feel a mix of awe and dread. Ares made things happen, but he also made things worse. He was the excitement of a new beginning, and the disaster of a bad ending. The Greeks didn't pray to him for victory as often as they did to Athena. They asked him to keep his distance, to let them have just enough courage to survive, but not so much that they lost control. Ares' story is full of warnings, but it's not all cautionary. There's a kind of honesty in the way he never pretended to be something he wasn't. He was flawed, impulsive, and sometimes reckless, but he was never fake. That's something the Greeks respected. Even if they didn't always like him, they saw themselves in his struggles, the times they acted before thinking, the moments when emotion got the better of them. Ares was a god, but he was also a lesson in what it means to be human. He never really learned from his mistakes, but he never stopped trying either. That's a lesson in itself. You don't always get to rewrite your story or fix what you broke. Sometimes you just keep going, hoping that the next time will be different. Ares taught that resilience isn't about getting it right, but about getting back up, no matter how many times you fall. Watching Ares, you see the cost of unchecked emotion. You see the value of strategy, of thinking things through. But you also see that passion has a place, that sometimes you need to care enough to fight, even if you're not sure you'll win. The Greeks didn't want to erase Ares from their stories. They wanted to remember that life is messy, that conflict is part of the deal, and that sometimes the things that make you difficult are the same things that make you strong. If you're still here, maybe you're wondering what it all means for you. What do you do with a story like Ares? Maybe you see a bit of yourself in his stubbornness, his drive, his refusal to give up. Or maybe you see the warning signs, the moments when it's better to slow down, to think before you act. Either way, the lesson isn't about being perfect. It's about knowing your limits and about finding that balance between passion and control. Ares never found that balance, but his story helps us see why it matters. He was a god who never stopped fighting, even when he was fighting himself. That's not a happy ending, but it's a real one. And sometimes that's the kind of lesson that sticks with you long after the story's over. So next time you hear about the god of war, remember, his life wasn't just about battles and grudges. It was about what happens when power meets impulse, when courage isn't enough, and when the fight goes on, even after the dust settles. Maybe that's why Ares still matters, because his story makes us ask ourselves what we're fighting for, and what happens when we let our own storms run wild. Look back at Ares' story, from his capture by the giants to being wounded by mortal spears, and you see that unchecked rage always demands balance. The myths don't just show a god losing his temper, they reveal what happens when anger goes unchallenged, and why even the strongest need to think before acting. Maybe you recognize echoes of a heated argument or a rash decision in Ares' impulsiveness. If you found this glimpse into Olympus interesting, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Which Ares episode surprised you most, his capture by giants or his defeat by Diomedes? Do you recognize any Ares-like impulses in your own life? Let us know in the comments.